Welcome back, everybody. It's been an exciting morning, hasn't it? And now we're going to try and get some conversations happening. We're a little short of time, as you might realise, so we're going to try and be a bit speedy, and we're going to use the wonderful technology that we've been given. So if you're not logged on, get yourself logged on. I'll be taking questions from the system, and those of you who have already understood that if you vote for a particular question, it goes up the screen, and then I'm able to moderate to make sure we have particular questions directed to the panel members. So if you could put the panel member's name in as the first part of the question, that'll help us to sort out how we do the Q&A stuff. And my admiration for Tony Jones has just gone up. I just wanted to introduce a small personal note into this, because all of us are touched by mental illness, mental ill health in our lives, in our families, friends, in our workmates, etc. And we had a wonderful story this morning, and I just wanted to reflect on that today. I'm an Anglican deacon, and one of the things we get to do is do funerals. And one of the funerals I conducted was for my elder brother, we were all fostered and adopted, and he had a difficult life, seriously mentally ill, and homeless from periods of time. But so we did the funeral, and there were families and friends around, and then a few weeks later, this appeared on the streets of Victor Harbor. We had nothing to do with this. So David had a subsequent career, which I didn't really know about, as a people's poet. And the community of Victor Harbor put that plaque up on the main street of Victor Harbor. It's on the CBA Bank. It's a little plaque on the wall. And he used to stand there and recite his poetry as a street person. And so I just wanted to reflect that the kind of redemptive aspect of what we were talking about, that people have value and contribute to communities and are appreciated by communities, even if the service system doesn't appreciate them. The community appreciates them. So somebody in the Victor Harbor community, and I have no idea who it was, organised that for my brother. And it's still there. It's an enduring memory. And I had no idea until I walked down the street and saw it. So I just wanted to reflect on that. Two of our speakers you've heard from previously. But to start the conversation, we thought we'd give David Butt and Chris Chamberlain an opportunity to provoke you and to see if we could generate some questions. Their resumes are on the page already, so you can read those. And I'd just like to then invite Chris Chamberlain up to give his presentation. Thank you. It's fairly tight space here. Okay, so forward, let's go forward. Press the green one. Oh, good.
Hello, everybody. I'm going to take a very slightly different angle from my colleagues who spoke this morning. I want to focus particularly on the relationship between homelessness and mental health issues. And as you probably know, I'm primarily a researcher, and I want to focus on three, quotation marks, factual points. And my whole talk will kind of be organised around those points. I'll explain them first, then I'll tell you where the information comes from, then I'll look at some of what we know about the points, and then very briefly, and you're entitled to tell me to hurry up. That's absolutely fine. I want to focus on 3 points. My first point is this, and I think this is a relatively straightforward point. We need to remember that not everybody who becomes homeless has a mental health issue. Secondly, and this is particularly important, some people have mental health issues before they become homeless. So in some cases, mental health issues are implicated in, quotation marks, the causal chain or the factors leading up to homelessness. Thirdly, other people develop mental health issues after they've been homeless, right? So for some people, the mental health issues come first, homelessness comes later. For other people, homelessness comes first, and the mental health issues come later, and homelessness is kind of, as it were, implicated in the causal chain leading up to that. Now, I actually want to talk briefly about a large study that I was involved in with my colleague and friend Guy Johnson, where we gathered information on approximately 5,000 people using services in Melbourne. And as you can see on the overhead, just under 4,300 of them were homeless using what we call the cultural definition of homelessness, which I'm sure you all know. In other words, they were homeless in the sense that they were either staying temporarily with other households, friends or relatives. They could have been in a boarding house. They could have been in emergency accommodation. They could have been sleeping rough, or of course, many of them were moving fairly frequently from place to place. We wanted to know how many of them had actually experienced mental illness. And we used 3 criteria that are shown up on the screen. I should say, the way we were doing this was basically we had permission from our university and from the organisations with which we were working to read the case files of people. So in some cases there was only a couple of case files, in other cases there were records going back over many years. And as we were reading through these, we were trying to assess whether the person had ever experienced mental health issues. We used 3 criteria. If the person had approached the agency seeking a referral for a mental health service, we counted them as having experienced mental health issues. Whether the individual was currently in or had been in a psych facility. And thirdly, whether the case notes themselves identified mental health issues. Now, what I want to show you is the 3 main findings. Firstly, we found that 31% of our sample had experienced mental health issues at some point in our lives. That actually is the various studies show different figures, but it's reasonably consistent with a number of other studies. I did notice the Minister quoted figures this morning, and she gave a figure of about a third, and then Debbie Faulkner quoted figures after her, and she also, using the national, what we used to call the National SAP data collection, quoted something like a quarter to a third of people have experienced mental health issues who become homeless. Now, this is probably the important point. When we went through trying to dig out what had happened, we found that 15% of our sample had had mental health issues first. Right? Homelessness had followed later, but we found 16% had developed mental health issues after they'd become homeless. So roughly similar sized groups. For one group, the mental health issues come first, then homelessness. For the other group, homelessness comes first, and then the mental health issues. Now, what are the consequences or what are the implications of this? And what do we know about these groups? I'll look at the group, first of all, where mental health issues came first. Now, the overall picture, I should stress, and all of you working services will know this, is the picture is complicated, there's lots of variation and so on. But I'm trying to point to kind of what I might call the typical patterns. 2 minutes, okay. Well, let me summarise then. I can do this, don't worry. For a fair number of the cases who became homeless, where mental health issues came first, they were youngsters aged 12 to 24, and particularly late teens, early 20s, and what seems to have happened was they developed mental health issues, the family couldn't cope, family relationships broke down, and the young person was either kicked out or they left voluntarily. The second pattern was lots of the people who had mental health issues first actually didn't become homeless till they were 30, 40 or 50. And what happened in those cases was the family hung in there when they had mental health issues, and it was when parent or parents died, they then moved into the homeless population because no other family members would, as it were, look after them. I need to be very quick. When homelessness, when mental health issues followed homelessness, there are a number of patterns which are summarised in the dot points. For some youngsters, they became homeless and then their mental health seems to have deteriorated as a consequence of the trauma they experienced. In other cases, it often appeared to be linked to they got substance abuse issues after becoming homelessness and then mental health issues. And then for the people who were older, who became homeless when they were 25 or older, in many cases, the mental health issues that followed were things like anxiety, distress, depression and so on. It's hardly surprising if you have a conventional house, you become homeless, you feel, distressed, upset, anxious and those sorts of things. Now, what are the implications of all of this? I'm going to miss that slide. If you look at the top line of that slide, the most important implication is regardless of which way they came in, nearly everybody had a long-term problem. The overall figure you can see is 79% in the right-hand column. Now, remember, we were collecting data on people at services. It's not the end of their homelessness. It may have gone on for longer than that. So, although people come in for different reasons, etc., and the population is diverse, people who have mental health issues tend to become long-term or chronically homeless. I'm only going to make two extremely quick points and I finish. One, you're not going to get that one.
Press the green button. Press the green button.
No.
Green. Yeah, give me the slide. I'll do it.
Don't worry, look, I can summarise the points. The first policy issue, no, it's not, don't worry. First policy issue that occurs to me is we need to provide families with support who've got young people who've got mental health issues. That's a really important initiative because in lots of cases when the young person leaves home, it's not what the family wants, it's everything has kind of gone wrong. The second point, and this is my last point, is obviously with many people with mental health issues, we're trying to look at long-term solutions, things like housing support, but we need to bear in mind that many people will need continuing support over long periods of time. I'll leave it at that, and I'm sorry I went on too long.
Thank you very much. Well done. You see, we can condense when we have to. So now we're going to ask David Butt if he wishes to make some points, and then we're going to be in questions. So get those questions typing away. The screen is very silent at the moment, so get those questions in. David.
Okay, thanks. And I'll try to be quite brief, given I think it's more important to have the conversation. But I would start by wanting to acknowledge those of you with a lived experience in mental health and suicide prevention. I mean, if you think 1 in 5 people every year experience a mental ill health problem, then, across this, it's 1 in 6 in the workforce because, of course, people with a mental ill health problem are not as highly employed. But you think about across the room, then there's a lot of people here who will experience a mental ill health problem, and I think the contribution you make to the system is extraordinarily important. I'm CEO, Commissioner, National Mental Health Commission. Jeff mentioned this morning about our review of the Australian mental health system, which is leading to fundamental reform, which I think is fantastic, which I would, and titled Contributing Lives, Thriving Communities, and that's the vision that we have for Australia, that if you can enable and support people to lead fully contributing lives where they participate in housing, employment, education, relationships, and health services where you need them, then you actually enable communities to thrive because the economics of mental ill health are enormous in terms of the fact that 50% of it hits by the age of 14 and 75% at the age of 25. So economic potential in terms of productivity growth and employment and so forth is huge. So, let's do all we can to enable people to lead contributing lives and therefore enable communities to thrive economically and socially. Of course, if you don't have a house, if you don't have a roof over your head, if you don't have stable accommodation, then it's very hard to actually do things like participate in employment and education. So, very obvious. I think a thing to highlight is about stigma and discrimination in relation to people with a mental ill health problem. We say we've come a long way in relation to reducing stigma, but that's more to do with the mild to moderate end, particularly with people, with anxiety, depression. It doesn't mean that we've actually done very well when you're getting to the more severe end, and particularly when you're dealing with severe depression or psychosis or whatever disorders you may have. And that particularly plays on ability to get into housing and keep housing. So I think the stigma area, we're going okay. Discrimination, we're not doing so well, and particularly when you get into places like workplace housing and the likes. I mean, the discrimination is very alive and active. I would emphasise the point of childhood trauma, and it's a huge issue, and one that I mean, you can talk about abuse or neglect, or you can talk about homelessness. I mean, up to 50% of children who live in a homeless situation in their families end up with a mental health problem. 80% of people who end up going to emergency departments, inpatient, outpatient services in hospitals have had childhood trauma. And it's a range of factors, but homelessness is a big factor in that. So I think it's and if we don't start at the very, I mean, one of the things we identified in our review is that we're not starting early enough. If you think about the first 1,000 days, there's a campaign around the world about the first 1,000 days, which starts from the point of conception up to the age of 2, which is about 1,000. How do you focus on supporting families, getting them into housing, for example, and giving them supports, building resilience for young children and the likes. Jeff mentioned the National Disability Insurance Scheme, which I think is fantastic in lots of ways, but for those who are currently getting services and under the NDIS miss out on services, where's the safety net for that? And I've had comments made to me by states and territories about, well, what's going to happen is they're going to end up either back in emergency departments or sleeping under bridges, and that's just not good enough. I do think there's a big issue, and I'll name South Australia in this, about the way that state services have rolled back when the Commonwealth has, sort of parachuted in various programs and said, oh, well, there's a gap here, and we didn't look at this. We looked at actually the systems approach. How do you fix the system rather than fix individual programs? But I do think there's this sort of missing middle that is growing, and that's between what GPs and primary health care can do and what specialist mental health services do. So unless you're in crisis, it's very hard to get into those services, and therefore what's the impact on those people if they're trying to actually have a stable life and live at home? And I do think that gets back to the issue of control versus influence. I think too often we focus on what we control, whereas what's important is what we influence, because you're never going to control everything. So if you want people to have stable housing, stable employment, and lead a contributing life, how do you use what resources and capacity you have to influence the outcomes for individuals, and I think and for their families and for the community? And I think we miss that point. I think too often people are too focused on what they control and not what they influence. Okay, that'll do.
Very, very succinct. Thank you very much, David. That's great. Now we've got approximately half an hour for this question and answer period, and I'm going to take them from the screen rather than from the floor, but if we run out of the screen, we'll go onto the floor. And if you put expert panel or the name of one of the panel members, that'll be terrific. So the first question is from Natalie. How can we shift our response to looking at homes rather than houses? i.e., is there a need to support people to build a home community life as well as to maintain a tenancy? And Rosanne, why don't you have a first shot at that?
I think I'll start in responding to that fine question with the point of start with the individual. It's been striking to us the degree to which people experiencing homelessness often have networks or relationships that they would like to rekindle and would like support in doing that. And so I think those relationships are, and reconnecting or building, helping people build strong ones, make the difference between houses and homes. And so my advice is, again, start with the person and with that as the objective, not simply a place where they can live permanently, but a range of choices that respond to what they are aspiring to create next in their life.
Right, sorry, I've just skipped ahead there. Does any other panel member want to make a comment on that first question, which I've taken off the screen? I actually really like the fourth question there, but we'll pass over that one and move on to the next question, which is, I didn't do it. How is the most needy identified when each individual will feel as though they are in need? So what scale is used to prioritise, and what happens to those who are always at the bottom of the list? So it implies there's a list. I think you explained something different in your presentation, so perhaps if you make a short go at that and then ask the other panel members to comment on that.
There is a by-name list in communities, but it's important to understand it maybe in the way, an intake department at an emergency room would have a list. Everyone will be assisted and be connected with what they need to address their problem, but it's not going to be the same response. And this clunkily named VI SPDAT is the common assessment tool that communities are using, so that at least there's some consistency around health risks and a way of understanding what is probably the least any person who is homeless at that given time, the least they would need based on objective information and that individual's own report of what they need in order to get them into some stable situation. So again, it's not that anyone on that list of people who are homeless would get nothing. It's not that everyone needs the same thing, and that the importance of this triage instrument here is to see that those who need long-term support are identified, and the effort begins to put that together, and those who have needs and aspirations that require a lighter touch or something more short-term or differentiated, that the work begins around that outcome.
Okay, other panel members, do you wish to jump in?
I really enjoyed Rosanne's talk about this aspect because it exactly parallels the challenge in the mental health system. I think essentially there is a trade-off between access and equity. So equity is when you try to make sure that people get a fair crack of the whip. And a reasonable approach to that is having standardised assessments like Rosanne's talking about, to say that we only give services to people who are most in need sounds eminently plausible. The problem is, exactly as the question puts it, who doesn't think their needs are pressing? And in that sense, I think in mental health, the debate has come to view equity too often as a form of rationing of the services that are available with apparently eminently defensible criteria, and yet still at the end of the day, the individual is the victim of the system. The system decides if they are worthy for this, that, or the other type of help. Now, that may be a very reasonable approach to managing resources that aren't adequate to needs. So it's not a general kind of issue I'm raising. But specifically, it seems to me that the way that systems advance is by giving more power to the individual. And as money is a form of power, the real transformative change comes when individuals can exercise their own choices rather than have someone else make those choices for them. In England, we're developing an approach called individual budgets, which give an allocation of money to people to spend on the services they deem needed in their recovery journey. And of course, your approach to working with people changes when you realise if they don't like you, they're not going to pay for you, and ultimately you won't have a job. So it has some really quite profound cultural and transformative implications.
All right, we've got a great question here, which we'll just highlight. Okay, it's from Hallett to the panel. If we're going to end homelessness in Adelaide and South Australia, including better services for mental health, what change would you focus on to make a change right now if you could? So the magic wand, the ministerial magic wand, is bestowed upon each of you, and we'll start with David and work across this way in the panel.
Oh, I think you get back to having a holistic approach. I mean, it's not about getting a house. I think the question before about having a home is really relevant, and it's quite interesting because if you look at the issue of diagnosis of mental illness and people going into housing, they're actually a lot of them are really quite stable because they're getting all this support wrapped around them. The problem we often have is that people are not diagnosed, they present late, they don't recognise their mental ill health problem. So it's about how you actually have a team-based approach, and you don't just look at a house as a solution. You actually look at what are the support services that are going in there, what's happening in relation to supporting them to, live daily living and, as far as possible, participate in employment, education, whatever they might need. So I think it's the issue about a holistic approach, and I don't think we do enough about that. We actually still operate in silos.
Okay. Clearly it's a very complex issue, but I still think that we need a proper supply of affordable housing. I mean, housing is unbelievably expensive. Unbelievably expensive in the capital cities. And rough sleeping is actually now, I think, is going up. The most recent survey in Sydney suggested that counted, I think it was about 420 rough sleepers, compared with about, I think it was about roughly 300 a year previously. The most recent survey of rough sleepers in Melbourne counted, I think, around about 240 compared with 120 2 years previously. And I know your most recent count of rough sleepers in Adelaide counted 89. And one of the things that I was actually quite struck by was I went for a walk near my hotel last night to go out and get something to eat, and there were people sleeping in doorways in Adelaide. And I've been in Adelaide many times, and I don't remember that before, although obviously I could have missed it in the past. So I do think, I mean, at a macro level, there really is an acute problem with, housing that people can simply afford. And the rough sleeping that's I live in the Melbourne suburb of St Kilda. I was walking in my local shopping centre the other day, and there were people sleeping in the doorways off of Ackland Street. Now, this is relatively new. I think the situation at the moment is getting worse, whereas you would all know that in 2008, the Rudd government set the target to halve homelessness by 2020.
Mike or Rosanne?
I have no magic wand.
The place I'd start is the by name list, because while more housing is needed in all of the state and territory capital cities where the vacancy rates are so low, and housing takes a while to build. So starting yesterday is a good idea, but knowing exactly how many individuals and the types of housing needs they have has been so important for kind of the expression we use is shrinking the change. And let's just say we're talking about 89 people in Adelaide. Knowing what kind of accommodation they need gives you an ability to have a very different conversation with private rental landlords, saying like, we need X number of one-bedroom flats, we need X number of shared accommodation that couples can use. Once you can get a problem boiled down to something that is more actionable for the community, it's been amazing for me to see how resources and communities in the United States have sort of materialized because these community teams have had a very specific request to go out and present to private rental owners. So that's not going to deal with your housing supply issues, but it is going to help you make rapid progress on housing people in homes with proper support to know as much as you possibly can, as quickly as possible, about who each individual is and what they believe is the solution to, the permanent solution to their homelessness.
If you're able to stay around and listen to Olive Bennell and her presentation, it's very powerful when we talk with politicians and we talk with radio stations this morning and you talk about particular individuals. So talking about we need a house for Sheila or we need a house for Fred is a lot different than saying we need a house for 89 people. If we know the people, then it becomes a completely different conversation. So I took that away this morning as the by name concept really fits, I think, with the direction that we need to go. And many of us are doing that already. Of course, we just need to do it together. Okay, so let's go on to another question, and let's actually, this is an interesting one. It's just coming up. So from Wilmot, the expert panel, is there going to be tracking of outcomes for tenancies transferred to the community housing sector? So that's a particular issue here in Adelaide, but if we could ask it should we be tracking outcomes for tenancies transferred to the not-for-profit sector? That is outcomes for individuals, I understand this means. Anybody want a shot? Rosanne looks as though she wants to. Off you go.
Certainly. I think tracking the impact of any policy shift is critical. There are always unintended consequences, and we should assume that that will happen and that we have to be nimble, and if things are going off course, that we correct them quickly. So anytime you're putting policy and vulnerable people together, I think you need to be really humble and realize that things could go wrong and you don't want to wait 5 years to figure that out, that you really have to be tracking carefully.
I mean, of course we should be tracking outcomes, but we should be very clear about what we're trying to measure. You can have the perverse incentives if you don't actually track the right things. And I think, it's an interesting one because the governments all around the country are running away from public housing and saying, private sector, NGOs, etc., should do this sort of area, this work. So I just think it's very important that the people who use the services are actually involved in determining what outcomes they're trying to achieve rather than governments determining what they think is the outcome that they want to achieve. Very different things.
David, while you've got the microphone, we've got a great question for you.
Oh, good.
Which I'm just trying to get up. It's not letting me. To David, this is from Gabby. The Contributing Lives report was over 1,000 pages long, whereas the federal government response was 25. Keeps moving up. Yes, there we are, we've got it. How successful are you at negotiating the 4 recommendations of your report?
Actually, my report was only 720 pages, which is very useful to carry around in Sydney on dark nights. Yep. I actually thought the government response, 25, 26 pages, was about right. Because we provided a lot of detail. We did a massive review, which has been generally well supported by the sector. People have generally agreed with the directions. I mean, 90% of people, well, everyone probably disagrees with something in there, but that's a good thing. I think we were highly successful in negotiating the government response, and the response, it's funny because mental health now leads, it's at the vanguard of reform of the overall system, I think. And I think other things will follow on as we go from a sort of Commonwealth government trying to dictate what happens locally to the Commonwealth moving away and letting local decisions be made. And so I think other services will follow that way. So, I've never seen a independent review so endorsed by a federal government, and I've worked with federal governments for a long time. I think the thing that I worry about is that it's a very health-focused response, and we get back to, if you're going to talk about contributing lives and thriving communities, it's all the other issues such as housing and employment and education, etc. So how do you use the funding that's being given to primary health networks to leverage a response at a local level across the community? So I think the last thing you wanted was a 400-page response from the federal government to a 720-page review, because they would have then been trying to dictate what happens locally. And I think there's still that danger because they've got to let go, and governments are not very good at letting go. Gets back to my point about control versus influence. So I think 26 pages was about right. But there's a long way to go. I mean, the whole thing is about implementation. Where do we go from here, and do we measure that it's actually been successful, and has it made a difference in anyone's life?
Doesn't actually take many words to say yes, does it? So hopefully the finances are going to flow. This is a question that came out of your presentation earlier, Rosanne. This is from Melissa. How do we change our culture from landlord to community maker, all owners contributing, or all stakeholders contributing to create the community?
I think we're all creatures who are influenced by our peers. And where I've seen really impressive efforts on the part of private sector landlords and not-for-profit landlords, it's usually like one or two really, leadership-oriented people, or organizations step up and demonstrate that, apartment buildings or flats, as you'd call them, buildings, homes, that they actually can be, quite relationship rather than transaction-based kinds of environments between the people who live there and their landlords. And so I think you start with your leaders, the people who have a vision for changing the nature of that relationship to more community maker, and then surround those people with other kind of early adopters. I think of landlord groups in Phoenix, Atlanta, Nashville. There's like one or two landlords who just were excited about how they could make a difference in their community. And, at the beginning, people looked at them suspiciously, and within a few years, there were very few landlords who didn't want to be part of, kind of changing the reputation of their firm or their business or, in the community. So that's the way it seems to happen. A few people who show the way and encourage others to join.
Other members of the panel want to comment on that?
I mean, I think it's quite tricky because in a free market economy, where lots of the housing is left to private enterprise, people are primarily motivated by, can they make a profit from the housing that they're renting out? Sorry, I'm speaking quietly. One of the things that's happened in our major capitals, Sydney, particularly Sydney and Melbourne, is the growth of rooming houses in recent years. And this is because you can, use colloquial words, you can make a quid out of running a rooming house. Now, what often tends to happen is the young entrepreneur finds a rundown property, maybe an old weatherboard that's going to be pulled down in the future, that's in very poor condition, and he or she can rent it for $300-400 a week. They can then turn each of those rooms into a boarding house room, including the garage and often partitioning rooms. And you can rent out those rooms in Melbourne at $180, $200, $220 a week. If you can rent out 8 of those, you can do the mathematics, 8 times minus what it costs. Lots of people in the major capital cities, well, not lots, but I mean, a new class of entrepreneur has emerged in the major capital cities who are now renting out basically boarding houses. And they're able to do this because the private rental market is so tight. So there are people on welfare benefits who can't possibly rent a flat on their own, but they can just about rent a room in a boarding house. And many of these properties are in very poor condition, and often they're short-term. I certainly accept there are other people in the community who have quite different attitudes and have contributed, very positively. But the need for public housing and community projects is very important, I think, in an Australian context. We've all been saying this for years, and the public housing supply has been shrinking, but it is particularly necessary in this context where the housing supply is in such terrible shape.
Chris, I have a question, which is, what would you recommend are the short-term remedies to limit that kind of exploitation, even as there needs to be a much more robust supply, commitment of affordable housing?
This is one of the dreadful dilemmas, because these boarding house rooms, when I've been to see some of them, are the last stop for keeping people off the streets. And there are now more people apparently showing up on the streets. And I have read reports in the Melbourne press and in the Sydney press the supply of boarding house, many of these boarding houses are now being, brought up for other purposes, as are caravan parks. So on the one hand, regulation is certainly needed to try and make, at the absolute minimum level, regulation to make sure that they're safe for things like fires. But I mean, it's a real dilemma, and I know many of you who work in service delivery will know exactly that problem. If this dreadful old boarding house closes, where are the people going? So I don't have, a very good answer to what is a very difficult problem.
I have a question from Katrina to the panel. How can different systems, housing, mental health, all the other services that have to be involved in individuals' lives or are involved in individuals' lives, apply the by-name principles and storytelling without at the same time increasing the burden of stigma and discrimination for individuals? I think that's probably, Rosanne, if you have a first go, others may want. I think the by-name, it captured our imagination, didn't it? But this is a good question.
I think it's probably helpful for me to clarify, the context within the by name list, the community list is constructed. It's not a list that's posted in the newspaper. It's the service providers all sharing the same information so that they use that as the glue to hold the team together and know that they're making progress with that person toward their goal. And so there's really no one in that problem-solving team who isn't already aware of all of the issues the person is facing. In the States, where volunteers have been involved in constructing the initial by name list, again, the invitation people are responding to help is around solving a problem for vulnerable people in their community. So the people who come out to help with that are probably the very people you need to enlist to be messengers of reduced stigma and to challenge discrimination. Certainly, I've seen so many examples of people who, in the very act of understanding a person's story and situation, they've had their own attitudes of discrimination and stigma completely shattered. And so, I actually think it kind of goes the other direction. The more people are known by the people who need and are committed to helping, that understanding is increased and the attitudes of discrimination and stigma are reduced.
David, you reminded us about stigma in your little presentation.
Yeah, I mean, it gets back to fundamentally you've got to be person-centred. And when I say person-centred, you're talking the individual, their families, their other supporters, and potentially the whole community, particularly when you're dealing with something like suicide prevention, which gets into this area as well. So it's that fundamental issue of saying it's about co-design, nothing about a person without that person. And so how do you do co-design models? How do you do co-commissioning? How do you do co-development of models of care or models of support? So it really gets back to people service providers being willing to let go and recognise that the person has to be at the centre of everything that is happening to them.
Can I just throw in some thoughts? I think it's a great question, and just for some empirical sort of evidence in relation to stigma, the global evidence is now really clear that the best way of reducing community-level stigma, that's to say public attitudes to people living with mental health problems, is through social contact. It's through actually meeting someone who they know from another mechanism, for example, their neighbour or the person they do something with, and then the person says, oh, and by the way, I have a diagnosis of X, or I've lived with these experiences, and suddenly that public attitudes demonstrably improve. Interestingly, that approach doesn't work for health professionals. So I'm doing a workshop tonight on lived experience workforce precisely because it's a really tough nut to crack of stigma in the system, but different topic. In terms of this great question, though, I guess there's a few things that we can do. Firstly, honour those standard bearers who are brave enough to put their story out there despite it being stigmatising.
As we had one this
Carrie,
morning.
thank you.
Carrie this morning, yes.
Secondly, we can set up speakers bureaus. That's to say, bureaus specifically supporting people who are prepared to tell their story through supervision, through support, evaluating the impact, providing peer support, making it easier for people to have routes to access recovery narratives. Thirdly, through media campaigns. You have national anti-stigma campaigns and local media campaigns. What stories about mental health appear in your papers?
Not great ones.
Fourthly, if you are in a privileged position like I am of being asked to speak at events, you can do what I do and now say, I will not speak there unless there is a lived experience speaker speaking with me.
Yep.
I was invited to speak by an unnamed European country's College of Psychiatry last year, and I put this out to them. That I said, I want to speak where there's a lived experience speaker. So there's a bunch of psychiatrists. They said, but we don't know anyone with lived experience. So the very fact of raising the question reframes the relationship.
They're not people, they're patients. The last question incidentally comes from the chair of the Anglicare SA board, Bruce. Panel, how could we approach an equivalent of Rosanne's 016 initiative in Australia from a national and state level? What is needed?
I guess that's me. There are certainly people I've spoken with as I've been in Adelaide this week who are intrigued, and I think step one would be to get you all together. The notion of who's prepared to kind of work at the community level beyond your organization or agency to solve that problem. It would require kind of getting uncomfortable for a bit, but there's so much progress on the other side if you can work as a team. I'll go back to that by name list. That team kind of needs to own the challenge together. With respect to a national approach, we have had queries from Queensland and Sydney and Melbourne about what it would take. In fact, I'm meeting with some of these groups tomorrow to see, what their sense of their readiness and, who, may be ready to think about moving forward. So I guess this really comes down to people ready to jump in and leadership.
Anyone else? I think the challenge is in front of us for that one. Can I ask you to thank the panel for lending us their expertise and time? And just to answer the fifth question from the top, as we've been meeting, 5 agencies, community housing agencies, have actually been presenting to Renewal SA for the further transfer of housing trust properties. Hopefully all of us will have included a great deal of capacity building and wraparound services in our presentation, because it is the way ahead. We do need to have much more attention to the individual, and to realise that we're not simply providing a landlord function anymore. We're providing so much more. It's been a fantastic start to a conversation, hasn't it? Long may it continue. And thank you all very much for giving your time today to this colloquium. Thank you.